Imagine standing at a crossroads where one small choice bends the path of history. You can almost see the map ripple, cities shifting, borders redrawn, lives rewired. World War II feels monumental, inevitable, the product of forces too big for any single decision. But what if it wasn't? Small delays, different weather, a missed intelligence report. Any of these could have nudged events onto another trajectory. What if Germany had captured Moscow? What if Japan never attacked Pearl Harbor? What if D-Day had failed? Tonight, you'll walk through 5 alternate scenarios that could have altered not just a war, but the shape of the modern world. These are not fantasy. They're plausible forks in a tense, dangerous road. Let's step in and see how close history sometimes comes to being something else. It's late 1942. The city of Stalingrad, scarred and smoked, becomes the stage for one of the war's bloodiest struggles. In our timeline, the encirclement of the German Sixth Army marked a turning point, a psychological and material blow to Nazi ambitions. But suppose the city fell quickly to German arms. What then? First capture of Stalingrad could have opened the way to the Caucasus oil fields. Oil was the lifeblood of mechanized war. Tanks and aircraft need fuel. Access to Baku and the surrounding fields would have given Germany more stamina. Not forever, but enough to sustain campaigns longer than expected. That extra fuel could have prolonged offensives, delayed Soviet counterattacks, and allowed Germany to redeploy forces elsewhere. Second, a Soviet collapse in the south could have a ripple effect on morale. Soldiers and civilians already strained by supply shortages and harsh winters might have faced a political shock. Cities east of the Urals housed vast factories, but morale and coordination matter as much as steel. A string of defeats could have slowed the Soviet war machine in unpredictable ways. Still, historians often point out a counterweight: the USSR's sheer scale. Industrial capacity had begun shifting beyond the Urals. Manpower reserves were gigantic. Even without Stalingrad, the Soviet Union had resources to keep fighting. So a German victory at Stalingrad likely wouldn't guarantee total conquest. More probable is a prolonged, bloodier Eastern Front. Years of grinding conflict that reshapes casualties, occupation zones, and the post-war map. Imagine a Europe where occupied territories linger longer under Nazi control, and where the eventual Soviet push westward meets a very different political landscape. That's a world where timelines stretch, and post-war treaties look markedly different. December 7th, 1941, feels like a single, explosive cleaving of history. The next day, the United States declares war, and American industry flips into total mobilization. But before Pearl Harbor, many in the U.S. still favored neutrality. If Japan had chosen to avoid attacking the American fleet, concentrating instead on rapid consolidation in Southeast Asia, the U.S. might have delayed full entry. Without immediate American involvement, Britain's strain would deepen. Lend-Lease aid could continue, but troop deployments, amphibious capacity, and strategic bombing campaigns would be limited by political will. The Soviet Union, while already bearing the brunt of Hitler's army, relied on American supplies in aircraft, trucks, and raw materials. Those supplies arriving later, or in smaller numbers, would tighten Soviet options. What about the Pacific? Japan's southward expansion might have succeeded faster, creating a defensive perimeter that was hard to penetrate. Without the shock of Pearl Harbor, American public opinion would have shifted more slowly. The U.S. might still enter eventually, perhaps after Germany's U-boat campaign crossed a certain line, or after another provocation. But timing is everything. A delayed U.S. entry could mean fewer American troops in Europe in 1944, possibly postponing or reshaping the Normandy invasion. The war could become more a battle of attrition, with shifting alliances and negotiated settlements rather than decisive late-war offensives. In short, avoiding Pearl Harbor could have turned a synchronized Allied effort into a longer, more fractured conflict. June 6, 1944, was a vast gamble. Thousands of ships, airmen and soldiers hitting fortified coasts under fickle skies. If weather had been worse, or German intelligence and reinforcements had been faster and smarter, the invasion could have failed catastrophically. A failed D-Day wouldn't necessarily mean Allied defeat worldwide, but it would have serious consequences. Western Europe's liberation would be delayed, perhaps by years. The Soviets, who were already pushing west, would likely reach deeper into Central and Western Europe before the Allies established a Western foothold. Imagine Paris, Brussels, and even parts of France falling under Soviet influence, not by ideology, but by occupation lines drawn by circumstance. Politically, that would drastically alter the Cold War. Instead of a relatively stable division between East and West, the Iron Curtain might shift further west. Western European governments could find themselves negotiating from a position of weakness, and post-war reconstruction might reflect a heavier Soviet imprint. NATO's formation, American troop deployments, and even the Marshall Plan could all look different, more urgent, more militarized, or negotiated with more concessions. Failure at Normandy would have been more than a military setback. It would have been a pivot point for global power balance. Operation Barbarossa began with staggering momentum. German forces advanced in a broad sweep, and for a time the capture of Moscow seemed possible. Yet winter, logistics, and determined Soviet defenses stalled the drive. Suppose, though, that German divisions had pushed through and seized the Soviet capital. Taking Moscow would have psychological and logistical effects. It would disrupt rail and telegraph networks, paralyze some government functions, and create a symbolic collapse in the eyes of many observers. The loss of the capital could have led to a crisis of confidence among allies and neutrals, perhaps eroding Lend-Lease support or altering diplomatic calculations. But would capturing Moscow topple the Soviet Union? Probably not outright. The USSR's government machinery and industry had contingency plans. Factories relocated east, leadership dispersed, and the population could continue resistance from Siberia to the Caucasus. The country's size and the resilience of its people would complicate any expectation of quick victory. In the end, holding Moscow might have granted Germany a notable propaganda victory and sped operations in the short term, but the long-term picture would likely remain one of fierce, prolonged conflict. Germany might have secured temporary advantages, but the enormous logistical burden and resilient Soviet infrastructure, perhaps insurmountable, challenge. In August 1945, 2 atomic bombs made a sudden horrific end to the Pacific War. Japan surrendered days later, but the Allies had already planned a full-scale invasion of the Japanese home islands, operations that were expected to be brutal and costly. If nuclear weapons had never been used, the war could have taken a very different final act. A land invasion would likely have stretched into 1946, with casualty estimates on both sides soaring. The prolonged conflict would have deepened suffering across the Pacific and consumed more resources. Importantly, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan in August 1945 and moved into Manchuria swiftly. Without atomic bombs ending the war quickly, Soviet forces might have occupied parts of northern Japan, including Hokkaido. That would open the real possibility of a divided Japan, similar to Germany or Korea, with Soviet influence north and American influence south. The absence of nuclear use would also reshape the early Cold War. The atomic bomb wasn't just a weapon. It was a political instrument that changed negotiation dynamics. Without the demonstration of such catastrophic power, the nuclear arms race might have developed differently, perhaps more slowly, perhaps with alternative diplomatic pressures filling the vacuum. The moral and political debates about nuclear weapons would look different too, and the post-war order in East Asia could be far less stable. When you stand back, the picture is complex. Allied victory in World War II rests on enormous foundations: industrial capacity, manpower, global coalitions, and strategic coordination. Those things don't vanish with the flip of a coin. Yet likely does not mean inevitable. Each scenario shows how fragile apparent inevitability can be. A single strategic decision to attack or not to attack, to delay or to advance, could change the pace and shape of events. Even an outcome that still leads to Allied victory might carry dramatically different consequences for borders, political influence, and the human cost. Think about the map of Europe after 1945. It was shaped by who occupied what, when, by which armies reached which cities first. A delayed American entry, a failed amphibious landing, a Soviet push deeper westward, or the absence of atomic bombing could each have redrawn that map in substantial ways. The Cold War itself might have begun under different stakes, with different alignments and different flashpoints, in ways that matter to everyday life: language, governance, alliances, even the cultural memory of nations. Your present is a direct descendant of those wartime choices. Small things like weather, timing, and logistics combined with human choices to forge a global order. That's not comforting, but it's clarifying. History doesn't march with inevitability. It meanders, bumps, and sometimes takes sharp turns because of things that at the moment seem small or trivial. So next time you hear that history was destined or preordained, remember these forks. The world that exists today is the result of countless hinge points, many of which could have tilted differently. The lesson: contingency matters, decisions matter, and the margin between one future and another is often thinner than it looks. Thanks for taking this tangent through history with me. 5 plausible what-ifs that show how different our world might have been if a few moments had gone another way. If one thing stands out, it's this: the past could have been stranger, and our present is the product of choices, chance, and endurance.